The flight attendant's voice boomed over the engine's roar. "Move to your designated seat immediately or security will escort you to the back." What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The airplane cabin was dimly lit by soft, warm lights that barely held back the creeping darkness of a night outside. Outside, heavy clouds gathered, and occasional lightning flashes split the sky with a stark, cold brightness. The constant hum of the engines blended with the low murmur of passengers, creating a feeling of quiet anticipation, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Every so often, a tremor of turbulence rippled through the cabin, mirroring the unsettled mood that lay thick in the air. In one corner by the window sat Eddie Kahn, a man whose eyes told stories of both deep sorrow and quiet determination. Eddie was a disabled veteran, marked by battles that had left scars on both his body and his spirit. His face, lined with the history of hard-fought struggles, showed a resilience that went far beyond his physical limitations. In his hands, he held a faded letter, a relic of the past that carried promises, memories, and a secret hope for redemption. The letter was worn and creased, a silent testament to a time when honor and sacrifice were not forgotten. Now, it was a constant reminder of everything he had lost and of the injustices that still followed him. The gentle light of the cabin revealed every detail of his worn features and the quiet strength that shone in his eyes, even as the storm outside raged on. Eddie's wheelchair, though a necessary part of his daily life, also stood as a symbol of a battle that had not been entirely won. Each time he shifted his weight, it was as if he was moving through layers of memory, layers filled with comrades' lost battles fought and promises made in the heat of conflict. Yet, even amid these heavy memories, there was a spark of defiant hope. All around him, other passengers sat in various states of quiet contemplation. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared out of the windows at the dark, stormy world below. For Eddie, however, the present moment was a blend of his inner thoughts and the tangible chill of the air. He recalled days when he had been filled with boundless energy and optimism, a stark contrast to the loneliness he now felt. His mind wandered to the times of camaraderie and courage during his service, a period when every hardship was met with unyielding resolve, and every setback was a call to rise again. Those days, filled with the spirit of brotherhood and unspoken loyalty, seemed both distant and achingly close. As the plane sailed higher into the night, the storm outside became a mirror for the turmoil Eddie carried within. The rumble of thunder and the flash of lightning were like echoes of battles past, moments of intense pain mixed with the fleeting glow of hope. Each flash illuminated the deep lines on his face, showing a man who had endured much yet was not ready to give up. In the brief moments of brightness, one could almost see the courage that lay beneath the sorrow. The quiet of the cabin was occasionally interrupted by the soft exchange of words between nearby passengers. Their conversations, filled with gentle concerns and murmurs about the weather, reminded Eddie that life went on, even in the face of personal trials. But for him, each word was a distant echo against the louder clamor of his inner memories. He knew that his struggle was not merely a personal one, it was shared by countless others who had given everything in the name of duty and had been left to pick up the pieces afterward. Every creak of the seat, every murmur of the engines, added to the feeling that this flight was not just a simple journey from one place to another, it was a small world filled with hidden stories and quiet battles. Eddie's thoughts turned to the letter in his hands once more. That letter, with its faded ink and delicate paper, was a reminder of promises that had been made and of a past that refused to fade quietly into oblivion. It spoke of a time when his sacrifices were recognized, when his bravery was celebrated, and when the ideals he fought for were held in the highest regard. Now, in this moment of isolation amid the vast, indifferent sky, that letter was his only companion, urging him to remember and to hope. The air felt heavy with an unspoken promise of change. Even as the turbulent weather outside painted the world in shades of gray and silver, Eddie's heart held on to the belief that somewhere, beyond the relentless storm, lay a future where his pain might be acknowledged and his sacrifices honored. It was a hope born from years of struggle and hardship, a hope that whispered, even in the darkest moments, that redemption was possible. In that silent, suspended moment, every sound in the cabin took on a deeper meaning. The soft hum of the engines, the distant roll of thunder, and the quiet rustle of fabric against tired bodies all contributed to a powerful, unspoken narrative. Eddie's inner voice, though quiet, was determined. It told him that despite the challenges he faced, despite the isolation and the neglect, there was a strength within him that could overcome even the deepest wounds. The letter in his hand was not just a relic of his past. It was a beacon, a small but steady light, guiding him toward a promise of justice and recognition. Eddie's struggle was a reflection of a broader battle, a fight against a world that often forgot the true cost of sacrifice. He had seen the cruelty of indifference, the way that heroes were cast aside once their usefulness had waned. Yet, as he sat there watching the storm outside, he also saw the possibility of change. The dark clouds, swirling in the distance, hinted at the coming of a new day, a day when the truth of his sacrifice might finally be seen. There was an unspoken tension in the cabin, a feeling that something important was about to happen, something that would challenge the very fabric of the world around him. Even in his quiet solitude, Eddie could sense that his journey was only beginning. Each moment aboard the plane was a step towards a future filled with uncertainty, yet it was also a step toward reclaiming his dignity. The turbulence of the night and the storm outside were not just obstacles to be endured, they were reminders that life, with all its trials, was a test of one's inner strength. Eddie resolved that he would not let his past define him, nor would he allow the cruelty of the present to erase the valor of his history. As the night deepened and the rain hammered the plane's exterior, Eddie's thoughts remained focused on the promise of a better tomorrow. He looked out at the dark horizon and silently vowed that his struggle was not in vain. Every scar, every memory, was a part of a larger story, one that was still being written, one that would eventually shine with the light of truth and honor. In that quiet, powerful moment, Eddie embraced both his pain and his hope, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with the unwavering determination of a true hero. And so, in the dim light of that airplane cabin, amid the low hum of the engines and the distant roar of the storm, Eddie Kahn sat with his eyes fixed on a future that, despite all its hardships, still held the promise of justice and redemption. The world outside might be dark and stormy, but within him burned a steady flame, a flame that would guide him through the night and into a new dawn. The steady hum of the engines was suddenly interrupted by a voice that cut through the murmur of conversation like a knife. In that moment, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted, and a chill seemed to replace the warmth of the dim overhead lights. Eddie sat quietly by the window, his eyes fixed on the stormy expanse outside, when a new announcement echoed in the confined space. It was not the gentle tone he had come to expect from the crew, but a voice that held a note of cold finality. "Attention passengers," the voice declared, "due to a seating error, we require that Mr. Khan exchange his seat with a passenger in first class." The words hung in the air like a verdict, and a murmur of disbelief ran through the cabin. Eddie's heart pounded as his gaze shifted from the tempest outside to the figures around him. The voice belonged to a flight attendant whose eyes were hard and unsympathetic. In that instant, Eddie felt the weight of judgment settle upon him, as if his very existence had become a liability in the eyes of those who had forgotten the sacrifices he had made. For a long, heavy moment, silence reigned. Eddie's mind raced as he clutched the faded letter in his hand, a letter that had once been a symbol of hope and honor, now feeling like a curse. He remembered the countless hours of training, the battles fought in faraway lands, and the camaraderie of those who had stood by him. But now, in the face of this unexpected demand, all those memories felt distant and diminished. The once proud veteran now felt reduced to a mere inconvenience, his life story overlooked in a single, cold command. The flight attendant's tone softened slightly as she repeated the request, yet there was an underlying edge that hinted at a deeper motive. "Sir, please understand, this is not a personal matter. It is simply a matter of protocol. We must ensure that all passengers are seated according to our revised guidelines." Her eyes, however, betrayed a glint of something unreadable, an emotion that could be anything from pity to calculated malice. Eddie's heart sank as he realized that the words, so neatly packaged as standard procedure, could not mask the disdain that lurked behind them. As he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty danced across the faces of the other passengers. Some looked away, unwilling to confront the situation. Others exchanged glances that spoke of silent judgment. In the midst of this, Eddie's thoughts drifted to the promise that the letter had once held. It was a promise of recognition and redemption, a promise that his struggles and sacrifices would be honored. Now, however, that promise felt like it had been shattered along with his dignity. The seat he had occupied for so long, a place that had witnessed both his quiet moments of introspection and his bold recollections of a past filled with valor, was now being snatched away from him with brutal finality. The flight attendant moved closer, her steps measured and deliberate as she extended a sealed envelope toward him. The envelope, embossed with a crest that Eddie could not immediately place, exuded an air of secrecy and importance. With trembling hands, he accepted it, the envelope cold and unyielding against the skin. There was no explanation given, no reassurance offered, only the silent pressure of expectation and the unmistakable signal that something was about to change. Eddie's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the envelope, his mind struggling to make sense of the sudden turn of events. As the cabin buzzed with the undercurrent of whispered speculations, Eddie carefully broke the seal of the envelope. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper, its surface marked with precise, deliberate handwriting. The words on the paper sent a shock of recognition through him, a cryptic message that hinted at a betrayal he had never anticipated. The message read simply, "Not all that is lost can be forgotten, and not every sacrifice is honored. The truth lies within the shadows you dare not face." Each word cut through him like a shard of ice, and he felt a cold dread spread through his veins. Had someone known of his past? Was this meant to unsettle him further, to remind him of wounds he had long tried to bury? The revelation in the envelope stirred memories that Eddie had fought so hard to keep at bay. He recalled nights of restless sleep, haunted by the ghosts of comrades and the echo of orders that had led him into dangerous conflicts. The letter, which had once been a cherished relic, now took on a dual meaning. It was both a reminder of honor and a portent of the dark secrets that still clung to his past. In that instant, the gentle cadence of the flight had given way to a harsh reality. His world was about to be upended by forces he had never seen coming. Eddie's pulse quickened as he scanned the faces around him. In the reflection of a darkened window, he caught sight of a figure whose expression was difficult to decipher. A passenger whose eyes met his with an intensity that seemed to convey both sympathy and something more sinister. The silent exchange between them was brief but profound, as if that stranger knew the weight of Eddie's history and the hidden burdens he carried. In that fleeting moment, Eddie sensed that the forces at play were not merely bureaucratic errors or casual oversights, but deliberate actions fueled by hidden motives. The betrayal that the envelope hinted at was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, more insidious pattern that threatened to engulf him. The engine's constant drone seemed to echo the relentless ticking of a clock, counting down to an uncertain future. Every shake of the airplane, every flash of lightning outside, underscored the gravity of the moment. Eddie felt as though he were suspended in a fragile balance between past and present, between the honor he once knew and the indignity he now faced. The envelope's cryptic message loomed over him like a dark cloud, its words a constant reminder that someone was orchestrating this moment of humiliation, and that the repercussions of this orchestrated betrayal might be far-reaching. In the midst of the growing chaos, the captain's voice returned over the intercom, urging calm and promising that the situation would be resolved shortly. But to Eddie, the captain's words rang hollow. The voice carried an air of detachment, as if the weight of what was happening in that moment was of little consequence to those in command. The disconnect between the official assurances and the raw, unfiltered pain that Eddie felt inside deepened his sense of isolation. It was clear that the protocols of the flight were not designed to address the profound human cost of neglect and indifference. For Eddie, the incident marked a turning point, a moment when the fragile boundaries of his world were shattered by an unexpected and emotionally charged betrayal. The envelope, the harsh words, and the silent, accusing glances of those around him all pointed to a truth he had long feared, that the forces he had once trusted might now be turning against him. The thought was almost too heavy to bear, yet it sparked a flame of defiance in his heart. Eddie resolved, in that instant, that he would not allow himself to be broken by this cruelty. The betrayal hinted at in the envelope was only the beginning. The true challenge lay in uncovering the hidden motives behind it and reclaiming the honor that had been stolen from him. As the flight continued its journey through the storm, Eddie sat in a state of contemplative turmoil. The envelope's message had forced him to confront the possibility that his past was not as distant as he had hoped, and that there were those who harbored secrets capable of undermining everything he believed in. Each thunderclap outside seemed to punctuate his thoughts, each flash of lightning a reminder of the fragility of trust and the ever-present threat of betrayal. His eyes, once filled with a quiet resignation, now burned with a fierce determination to find the truth hidden within those cryptic lines. The soft rustle of fabric and the muted conversations of the other passengers faded into the background as Eddie's focus narrowed on the challenge before him. He felt as though he stood at the threshold of an unknown realm, a place where loyalty and treachery danced in a delicate, dangerous balance. The inciting moment had shattered the fragile calm of his journey, thrusting him into a maelstrom of suspicion and unresolved grief. And yet, even as the darkness outside threatened to swallow him whole, a small, stubborn light burned within Eddie, a light that promised that no matter how deep the betrayal, he would find the strength to rise again. In that turbulent hour, as the airplane cut through the storm, Eddie understood that his life was about to change irrevocably. The mysterious event that had disrupted his status quo was not merely an unfortunate accident or an administrative error. It was a deliberate act, one that would force him to confront long-buried secrets and hidden enemies. And as he stared out into the swirling darkness, Eddie made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth no matter the cost, and in doing so, he would reclaim the honor that had been denied him for far too long. The storm outside raged on, but inside the airplane, a quieter storm was beginning to form among its passengers. Eddie sat in his seat, the faded letter still weighing on his heart, when he noticed a subtle exchange of glances between two men sitting a few rows ahead. Their eyes, filled with unspoken worry, reminded him that everyone on board carried a secret burden. One of them, a man in a worn leather jacket, caught Eddie's eye and offered a nod of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of shared pasts that few ever spoke of openly. As Eddie shifted in his seat, he recalled the many nights spent reflecting on choices made long ago. The memory of his service, of comrades who had been lost and promises left unfulfilled, filled him with both sorrow and determination. He was not alone in his suffering. Across the aisle, Marty Reed, a fellow veteran with quiet intensity and a scar that ran deep both physically and emotionally, watched the scene with a careful gaze. Marty had been a silent friend for years, someone who understood the unspoken language of pain and resilience. Their eyes met, and in that glance, a bond was reaffirmed, a shared understanding that the burdens of their past were never easily forgotten. Marty leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eddie, I see in your eyes. The storm isn't just outside, is it?" he asked gently, his tone laced with both empathy and concern. Eddie's response was slow and measured, as he struggled to find the right words. "Every time I see a storm, I think of the battles I've fought. Not all the fights are on the ground, Marty. Some happen in the quiet corners of our hearts." His words were soft, but each one carried the weight of unspoken memories and unresolved pain. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant murmur of other passengers, each voice a thread in the larger tapestry of the night's unfolding drama. The cabin was a microcosm of hidden lives and concealed secrets. Nearby, a middle-aged woman quietly consoled a younger traveler, her gestures speaking of loss and hope in equal measure. In the background, murmurs of discontent and cautious glances were exchanged between a group of passengers who, like Eddie and Marty, had felt the sting of past betrayals. It wasn't long before Captain Doyle's presence was felt again. The man who had earlier demanded Eddie move from his seat now stood near the front of the cabin, his face drawn in a mask of false calm. His eyes, however, betrayed hints of inner turmoil and perhaps a struggle to justify his actions. As he moved through the aisle, his footsteps were measured, almost as if he was retracing the steps of a decision made in haste, a decision that had cost him dearly in ways only he might understand. Olivia Sterling, ever watchful and composed, observed these subtle shifts in the air. She had a way of noticing the things others missed, and in the quiet moments between the announcements and the soft hum of engines, she silently catalogued every emotion, every tremor of guilt or defiance. Her eyes were kind, yet piercing, a reminder that sometimes truth lay hidden behind polite smiles. Olivia approached Marty quietly and said, "There is more to this story than the simple rules of seating. Look into the eyes of those around you. You will see echoes of old promises and forgotten loyalties." Her words, though soft, carried a firm conviction that resonated with the others. Later, as the turbulence of the night grew fiercer, the cabin filled with whispered conversations and tentative exchanges. Eddie found himself drawn into a quiet discussion with Marty near the back of the plane. The two veterans spoke not just of their shared military past, but of the everyday injustices that they had witnessed long after their service ended. Their voices were low, their words carefully chosen, as if speaking too loudly might invite unwanted attention. "I remember the camaraderie we once had," Marty said, his eyes distant with memories, "back when every man had another's back, no matter the cost. Now, it seems the only thing left is a string of orders that make us feel small, like our sacrifices mean nothing." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the deep pain that lay beneath his composed exterior. Eddie nodded, his gaze fixed on the envelope that had disturbed his peace. "I feel it too. That letter, the way they treated me today, it all feels like a test of whether I can still stand tall in the face of betrayal." His tone was one of reluctant acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that some wounds, even if hidden, would always remain. Between them, the unspoken understanding grew. Their conversation turned to the people responsible for the cruel orders, to the higher-ups who seemed more interested in maintaining a system of control than in recognizing true sacrifice. Captain Doyle's actions, which had initially struck Eddie as a simple mistake of protocol, now seemed to carry an undercurrent of personal vendetta and deeply buried resentment. It was as if every move he made was shadowed by a long-held grudge, a grudge that might one day erupt into something far more dangerous. At one point, a hushed discussion broke out near the front of the cabin, where a small group of passengers questioned the sudden reassignments and the mysterious envelope. One passenger, a soft-spoken man with tired eyes, asked quietly, "Why do they treat him this way? What secret is being kept from us all?" His words, floating on the edge of rebellion, were met with a mix of fearful glances and determined nods from those around him. Olivia, still standing near the front, overheard the exchange and stepped forward, her voice calm yet laced with authority. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "the truth is hidden not because it is unimportant, but because it is too painful to face. Our systems are built on secrets and sacrifices, but tonight we are all bound by the truth that lies beneath these small acts of cruelty." Her words, meant to reassure, also hinted at the deep currents of betrayal that ran through the ranks of those in power. In the midst of these unfolding dramas, Eddie's thoughts turned inward. He remembered the times when honor and duty had meant more than personal gain, when every order came with the promise of glory and mutual respect. Now, as he listened to the quiet conversations around him, He wondered if those days were forever behind him. The letter in his hand seemed to mock him with every word. Its cryptic message, a reminder that not all sacrifices were celebrated, and some were used to fuel a darker agenda. The tension built gradually, layer upon layer, as hidden motives came to light through small, almost imperceptible interactions. A glance here, a murmured comment there. Each detail wove a more intricate web of relationships and unresolved conflicts. Marty's whispered reminiscences, Olivia's probing questions, and the collective sighs of discontent among the passengers all converged into a palpable sense of inevitability. It was clear that the calm facade of the flight was about to shatter, revealing the raw emotions that lay hidden beneath the surface. As the airplane continued its course through the turbulent skies, the passengers settled into a tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Eddie felt the weight of responsibility, not only for his own wounded pride, but also for the unspoken promise to those who had once stood with him in the fires of battle. The realization came slowly, like the soft murmur of rain against the window, that the true battle was not against the elements, but against the systemic betrayal that had left scars far deeper than any physical wound. In this quiet moment of introspection, Eddie resolved to seek answers. He would uncover the hidden truths behind the cruel orders, behind the mysterious envelope, and perhaps even behind the eyes of Captain Doyle himself. The relationships that had formed in these cramped rows of an airplane were not merely coincidental. They were threads in a tapestry of loyalty, betrayal, and the unyielding quest for dignity. The discussion among the passengers, the whispered confidences, and the silent support exchanged in fleeting glances all spoke of a deeper need for justice, a need to reconnect with the honor that had once defined them. And as Eddie and Marty continued their low conversation, their voices merging with the distant sound of the storm, a quiet determination took root. They would no longer allow the remnants of past betrayals to define their future. In that moment, the airplane was more than just a vessel cutting through a stormy night. It was a crucible in which old wounds would be healed and new alliances forged. And though the challenges ahead were uncertain, the bonds formed in that fleeting time promised that Eddie Marty and those who shared their pain would face the coming trials together, united by a common desire to reclaim the honor that had once been their guiding light. The hum of the engines and the low murmur of whispered conversations created a fragile cocoon around Eddie as the night deepened. The mysterious envelope and its cryptic message had already rattled him, but nothing could have prepared him for the revelation that was about to unfold. As the plane steadied for a moment in the midst of turbulence, a subtle shift in the atmosphere hinted that nothing was as it seemed. Eddie's mind churned with conflicting emotions. He recalled Marty's soft, reassuring words earlier, their shared memories of battle and loyalty. Yet, as he looked into Marty's eyes now, there was something unsettled, a flicker of hesitation that did not belong. He could not pinpoint it at first. It was buried under layers of fatigue and pain. But as the minutes ticked by, that flicker grew into a burning question. Quietly, Eddie leaned over and whispered, "Marty, I need to understand something. That envelope, it came at a moment when everything changed. Do you know anything more about it?" His voice was low, laden with both concern and a dawning suspicion that perhaps the envelope was not a random act, but something orchestrated by someone close. Marty's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, a moment so brief that Eddie almost dismissed it as weariness. But the change was too sharp to ignore. I'm not sure what you mean," Marty replied, his tone faltering ever so slightly. The words hung between them, a silent invitation to a truth that neither wanted to face. Before Eddie could press further, a hushed conversation began at the rear of the cabin. A group of passengers, previously content to murmur among themselves, exchanged intense, hurried words. Their eyes darted around nervously, and one man in particular, with a tired expression and wary glances, whispered, "It's all part of the test. None of it is what it seems." His voice was barely audible over the steady drone of the engines, but it was enough to send a chill down Eddie's spine. Unable to shake the unease, Eddie's thoughts raced back to the envelope and its haunting message. The words, "Not all that is lost can be forgotten," and "Not every sacrifice is honored now took on a new weight. He began to wonder if his own sacrifices had been manipulated to serve someone else's purpose. Was this humiliation designed to break his spirit, or perhaps to test his loyalty in ways he had never imagined? Eddie's eyes searched the cabin, landing on Olivia Sterling. Her composed demeanor had not wavered, yet there was an intensity in her gaze that seemed to challenge anyone to question her, as if sensing his internal battle. She moved gracefully towards him and Marty, her steps purposeful and quiet. "Eddie," she said softly, "sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight, behind the masks we all wear." Her words were gentle, but they carried a weight that unsettled him further. Olivia's presence had always been a symbol of strength and guidance, but now there was an undercurrent of something else, something secret and unsettling. Eddie's mind began piecing together fragments of overheard conversations and fleeting looks. It wasn't just Captain Doyle's cold command or the mysterious envelope that now troubled him. It was also the way Marty's eyes had betrayed a secret when he thought no one was watching. As if compelled by an unspoken need for the truth, Eddie pressed, "Olivia, what is really happening here? I feel like there's a hidden plan behind all of this." For a long moment, Olivia's gaze shifted away, as if weighing her next words carefully. Then, in a hushed tone meant only for their ears, she replied, "There are forces at work that you cannot yet understand, Eddie. Sometimes those you trust are compelled by their own demons to act in ways that hurt the ones they care about. Sometimes the ones you believe are fighting for you may be fighting for something else entirely." Her words, though measured, sent a sharp spike of pain and betrayal through Eddie's heart. A heavy silence fell over them, punctuated only by the distant rumble of thunder outside and the rhythmic pulse of the engines. Marty's face was now an unreadable mask. His eyes flickered with emotion, remorse, guilt, or perhaps defiance. And in that moment, Eddie felt the first true sting of betrayal. Could it be that the man he had confided in, the friend who had shared his deepest memories of camaraderie and loss, was not entirely on his side? The turning point came when a quiet passenger, whose voice had been lost in the din of earlier whispers, stepped forward. "I can't keep it hidden any longer," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. "Marty was never just a fellow soldier. He was sent to monitor you." The declaration, spoken in a barely audible tone, struck Eddie like a physical blow. The idea that Marty, whose loyalty Eddie had trusted implicitly, might have been an agent in a larger scheme was almost too much to bear. Marty's eyes widened, and for a fleeting second, his carefully constructed facade crumbled. He looked around desperately, as if trying to find an escape from the rapidly closing net of suspicion. "Eddie, listen," he began, but his voice trailed off, drowned by the intensity of the accusation that now filled the narrow space between them. Eddie felt a cold dread creeping over him. Memories of past missions, the brotherhood he thought was unbreakable, began to twist into images of betrayal and hidden agendas. The once familiar voice of Marty now seemed alien, as if the man who had once shared in the honor of their service was a stranger manipulated by forces beyond their control. "Is it true?" Eddie demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Were you sent to watch me?" Marty hesitated, his face contorting with inner conflict. Finally, with tears glistening in his eyes, he whispered, "I was ordered to be here, Eddie. I never wanted to hurt you. They told me it was for your own good, that you needed to be tested, that your past, your sacrifices, were all part of something bigger. I tried to warn you, but I was caught between duty and loyalty." His confession was raw, laden with regret. As he sank lower into the seat, his head bowed in anguish. The revelation sent shockwaves through Eddie's entire being. Everything he had believed about his life, his honor, and the friendships that had carried him through the darkest times now felt tainted. The envelope, the humiliating order to move seats, the cold eyes of those around him, they were all parts of a larger, more insidious design. Someone or some group had orchestrated these events, and Marty was merely a pawn in that game. Olivia's voice broke through the charged silence once more. "Eddie, please understand," she said, her tone urgent yet sorrowful. "This was not meant to break you. It was meant to reveal the truth, to force you to confront the reality that sometimes the system you fought for is corrupted from within. I tried to protect you, but the truth was too dangerous to hide forever. Eddie's heart pounded as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a nightmarish picture. The betrayal was deeper than he had imagined. It was not just a single act of treachery, but a systemic manipulation that had seeped into every corner of his life. The man who had once stood by his side in battle was now a reminder of how loyalty could be twisted into a tool for control. His eyes burned with a mix of betrayal and a fierce determination that he had not felt in years. "How could you?" he whispered, not just to Marty but to the very idea of trust and honor he had held dear for so long. Marty's voice cracked as he tried to explain, "I did it because I believed they were trying to save you from a path that would only lead to more pain. I was forced into a situation where I had no choice but to obey orders. I never wanted to see you hurt, Eddie." His confession, full of anguish and regret, did little to ease the searing betrayal Eddie felt. In that fraught moment, Eddie realized that the enemy was not always the obvious one. The true betrayal was hidden in the hearts of those he had loved and trusted. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within him, and as the plane continued its journey through the dark skies, Eddie felt more alone than ever. The journey that had begun as a quest for honor and redemption was now mired in deception, leaving him with a singular, painful truth. Sometimes, the greatest wounds come from within. The flight, once a vessel of transit and routine, had transformed into a crucible of raw emotion and harsh revelations. Each passenger, every whispered conversation, now took on a new significance in the light of Marty's confession. Eddie's resolve hardened with every tear he fought back, every bitter memory of trust betrayed. The revelation of Marty's true role was not just a twist in his story, it was a pivot that would determine the course of everything that was yet to come. As the airplane soared through the storm, Eddie sat in a state of deep introspection. He knew that uncovering the full extent of the betrayal was now imperative. The delicate balance between loyalty and treachery had been irrevocably shattered, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. Yet in the midst of the heartbreak, there flickered a stubborn spark of defiance. He vowed, silently, that he would expose the hidden hands that manipulated his fate and reclaim the honor that had been stolen from him. In that long, agonizing moment of truth, Eddie realized that the journey ahead would be more treacherous than any battle he had fought in the past. The enemy was not a faceless adversary on a distant battlefield, but the betrayal of someone he had once called a brother. And as the storm outside began to ease, ever so slightly, the seeds of a fierce, burning determination took root in Eddie's heart, a determination to confront the hidden forces behind the treachery, no matter the cost. Eddie sat alone by the window as the plane continued its journey through the stormy night. The earlier revelations still weighed heavily on his heart, and every flash of lightning outside reminded him of the betrayal that had shattered his trust. Now, as the hum of the engines melded with the distant roar of thunder, a new challenge began to emerge, one that forced Eddie to confront the turmoil within himself while facing threats from forces beyond his control. A sudden jolt of turbulence rocked the plane, and passengers cried out as they clutched their armrests. Eddie's body tensed with the familiar fear of sudden drops and unpredictable shakes. In that moment, the physical instability of the aircraft mirrored the uncertainty swirling in his mind. Every bump in the flight felt like a reminder of the chaos within his soul, as if the very air around him was charged with the conflict between loyalty and betrayal. He glanced over at Marty, whose eyes were downcast and troubled. The earlier confession still echoed in his mind, and Eddie struggled to reconcile the friend he had once trusted with the secret that now hung between them. The turbulence outside was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. He remembered the moment when Marty had admitted to being ordered to watch over him, a revelation that had fractured the foundation of their brotherhood. Now, with the plane shaking and voices murmuring in anxiety, the weight of that betrayal pressed down on him even harder. As the turbulence subsided, the cabin fell into an uneasy silence. Olivia Sterling moved among the passengers with deliberate calm, her presence a steadying force amid the fear. Yet even her confident demeanor could not fully hide the strain in her eyes. She stepped close to Eddie and Marty, her voice soft but urgent. "We must remain strong," she said, as if speaking not only to them, but to everyone on board. "The challenges we face now are not merely the flight's turbulence, but something far deeper. We are at a crossroads, and difficult choices lie ahead." Eddie's heart pounded as her words sank in. In that moment, he realized that his battle was no longer confined to the betrayal of a trusted friend. It was now intertwined with a larger, hidden conspiracy that threatened to upend everything he had fought for. His mind churned with questions. Who were the true orchestrators of this cruel game? What was the purpose behind forcing him into this humiliating situation? And most of all, what path should he choose now? One that might lead him further into the shadows of betrayal, or one that would risk everything to reclaim his honor? The flight attendants hurried back and forth, trying to restore order among frightened passengers. Their voices, calm but strained, offered reassurances that the turbulence was only temporary. Yet every time Eddie heard their soothing words, a sense of foreboding settled deeper into his chest. It was as if they too were aware that the situation was more than a mere technical glitch in the flight schedule. The hidden forces behind the manipulation were stirring, and the conflict within the cabin was about to intensify. In a quiet corner of the plane, a heated conversation erupted among a small group of passengers who had gathered after hearing snippets of the earlier revelations. Their voices rose in anger and confusion, each person grappling with their own doubts about the integrity of those in charge. One passenger, a man with weary eyes and a trembling voice, demanded, "How can we trust anyone now? If our heroes are betraying us, then what hope do we have?" His words resonated with the crowd, igniting a spark of defiance that quickly spread through the aisle. Eddie felt his pulse quicken as the murmurs grew louder. Every accusation, every fearful glance exchanged between strangers deepened his sense of isolation. He could no longer ignore the truth that lay before him. His journey was not just a personal struggle, but a mirror of the larger battle between corruption and honor. In that moment, the internal dilemma became painfully clear. He had a choice to make. Should he continue to cling to the remnants of his past and hope for redemption, or should he confront the hidden enemy head-on, even if it meant severing the last ties to the loyalty he once knew? As the conversation in the cabin escalated, Olivia's steady voice cut through the tension once more. She gathered a few of the more composed passengers around her and spoke with quiet determination. "I know you all feel betrayed and scared," she began, her eyes scanning the room with empathy. "But anger alone will not mend our broken trust. We must choose to stand together, to seek the truth rather than letting fear and suspicion tear us apart." Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much injustice to turn a blind eye. Even as the storm outside raged on, her voice brought a fragile hope that perhaps, in unity, they might overcome the dark forces at work. Eddie listened intently, feeling torn between the desire to trust her and the deep-rooted hurt caused by Marty's confession. Every word from Olivia stirred conflicting emotions within him. He wanted to believe that there was a way to restore the honor he had lost, yet the betrayal by someone he had considered a brother made him question whether redemption was even possible. His thoughts swirled as he recalled the moments of warmth and camaraderie from his military days, a time when trust was implicit and every man stood shoulder to shoulder against common enemies. Now, that sacred bond seemed tarnished by the weight of hidden agendas and manipulated loyalty. In a brief moment of clarity, Eddie realized that the external chaos was a reflection of his internal struggle. The turbulence of the plane, the rising voices of discontent, and the murmur of whispered secrets were all parts of the same battle. A fight not just against the forces that sought to undermine him, but also against the inner demons that threatened to consume his spirit. His mind wandered back to the faded letter clutched in his hand, a reminder of promises made long ago, and of a time when sacrifice was honored rather than exploited. That letter was a beacon in the darkness, urging him to find the strength to rise above the betrayal and fear that now clouded his judgment. With every passing moment, the stakes grew higher. The angry questions from the passengers were no longer just noise, they were a call to action, a demand for accountability from those who had once held positions of power. Eddie knew that staying silent was no longer an option. The painful truth had been laid bare, and the choice before him was stark: either retreat into the safe shell of resignation or fight for the honor that had been stolen from him, even if it meant facing down those he once trusted. As the plane began its descent into calmer skies, the tension inside the cabin remained palpable. Eddie sat silently, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon through the small window, while the internal battle raged within him. The storm had passed outside, but the emotional tempest continued unabated. He felt a deep, aching pull toward retribution, a desire to expose the hidden conspiracies and to reclaim his lost dignity. Yet, at the same time, the thought of confronting the truth, of challenging the established order, filled him with dread. The path ahead was uncertain, and every step would force him to face the painful possibility that not only had the world betrayed him, but that he might have been complicit in his own downfall by trusting too easily. In the quiet that followed, a decision began to take shape in Eddie's mind. He would no longer allow himself to be a passive victim of forces he could not control. The difficult choices he faced were not merely about whether to fight back or to yield. They were about defining who he was and what he would stand for in a world where loyalty had been manipulated and honor was a rare, fragile commodity. With a heavy heart and a steely resolve, Eddie vowed that he would uncover every hidden truth, confront every betrayer, and rebuild the shattered pieces of his identity, no matter the cost. The emotional stakes had never been higher, and as the passengers around him settled into an uneasy calm, Eddie understood that the battle for his soul was just beginning. Every whisper, every uncertain glance, and every word of defiance from his fellow travelers served as a reminder that the journey ahead would demand sacrifices he had not yet imagined. But in that very uncertainty lay a spark of hope, a chance to rewrite the narrative of betrayal into one of courage, resilience, and ultimately redemption. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Eddie's internal conflict reached its crescendo. The choices he faced were immense and fraught with danger, yet deep within him, a quiet determination was taking root. In that moment, surrounded by strangers who had become unwilling allies in the face of shared adversity, he made a silent promise to himself. He would not let fear or betrayal dictate his fate. Instead, he would step forward into the unknown, armed with the truth and a will as unyielding as the storm that had brought him to this crossroads. The tension reached its peak as the plane began its final descent, and the atmosphere inside the cabin grew almost unbearable. The low hum of the engines was now accompanied by a charged silence, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder from outside. Eddie's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, his resolve steeling him against the betrayal and confusion that had haunted him for so long. Every face in the cabin seemed to carry a story, a burden, and as the airplane tilted slightly, it felt as if the entire world was holding its breath for what would come next. Eddie moved slowly down the aisle, his eyes fixed on Captain Doyle, whose earlier cold command had set off a chain of events that now spiraled toward a climax. The captain's face was a mask of unease, the bravado of his earlier posture gone, replaced by fear and guilt. Passengers, who had once sat quietly in their seats, now turned their eyes toward the center of the cabin as if drawn by an unseen force, waiting for the truth to burst forth. A voice, strong and clear despite the turmoil, cut through the thick silence. "Enough!" Olivia Sterling stepped forward, her tone commanding attention. The soft lighting of the cabin illuminated her determined face, and her eyes shone with both sorrow and strength. "It is time to face the truth. No more secrets. No more lies." Her words rippled through the room, and even the turbulent hum of the engines seemed to slow, as if nature itself was pausing to listen. At that moment, all eyes turned to Marty, whose earlier confession had already shaken Eddie to his core. The air grew so heavy that each breath felt like a struggle against an unseen force. Marty, his face etched with regret, took a deep breath. His voice trembled, but he continued, "I was sent to watch over you, Eddie. I was ordered by those above to test your loyalty, to see if your honor would still stand in the face of betrayal. I was forced to hide my true feelings to pretend that I was your friend when, in truth, I was a part of something much darker." His words fell like heavy stones into the silence of the cabin. Eddie's eyes widened, a mix of anger and heartbreak burning in their depths. Every memory of brotherhood and shared sacrifice seemed to shatter in that instant. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound inflicted on the battlefield. "Why?" Eddie managed to choke out, his voice thick with pain. "How could you be part of this? How could you let them use our past, our honor, as a weapon against me?" Marty's shoulders slumped, and tears began to streak down his cheeks. "I had no choice, Eddie. They promised that by doing this, they would protect you from a fate worse than what you have already endured. I believe they wanted to save you, but in the end, I became a tool for their manipulation. I am so sorry." His voice was barely audible, a whisper that carried the weight of all the years spent in conflict and regret. The plane shuddered once more as it responded to the storm outside, and the lights flickered. In that brief moment of darkness, the cabin seemed to transform into a stage where every hidden emotion was laid bare. Olivia's eyes swept over the passengers, and she spoke again, her voice softer now, laden with an urgency that demanded understanding. "This is not just about one man's betrayal. This is about the system that has forsaken those who gave everything. This is about the way we are treated when our worth is measured not by our sacrifice, but by our usefulness." Captain Doyle, who had tried to remain silent, stepped forward now. His face was drawn and pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable fear. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said in a strained tone. "I was following orders. I was trying to keep control in a situation that was spiraling out of hand." His words did little to ease the tension, and the truth of his complicity in the betrayal was clear to everyone present. Eddie felt a surge of determination rising within him, a force that pushed aside the pain and the shock. He took a step closer to Captain Doyle, his voice firm despite the turmoil raging inside. "No more excuses," he said. "You used your power to humiliate me, to test me, and in doing so, you have forgotten what honor truly means. I have fought for a country, for my comrades, and for every sacrifice made. And I refuse to be a pawn in your twisted game any longer." As Eddie's words echoed through the cabin, the storm outside seemed to mirror the inner chaos of the moment. Rain pounded the windows and lightning illuminated the faces of the passengers, each one reflecting a mixture of fear, anger, and hope. In that charged atmosphere, the cabin was transformed into a battleground of truth and consequence, where every word carried the weight of lives forever altered. Olivia placed a steady hand on Eddie's shoulder, offering silent support as he continued his confrontation. "You have every right to feel betrayed," he said, his voice rising with a newfound clarity. "But today I choose to stand for the truth. I choose to expose the corruption that has infiltrated our lives. No longer will our sacrifices be twisted for personal gain. I will reclaim my honor, and I will demand that those who have used our pain for their own benefit face the consequences." A murmur of agreement began to ripple through the crowd. Some passengers, emboldened by Eddie's courage, stepped forward, their voices joining his in a chorus of defiance. The cabin, once a place of quiet resignation, now thrummed with the energy of a collective uprising. It was as if every soul on board had been waiting for this moment, a moment when the truth, no matter how painful, would finally be revealed. Captain Doyle's eyes darted from one determined face to another, and he seemed to shrink under the weight of the revelations. The power he once wielded now felt like a brittle shell, unable to contain the force of the emotions unleashed before him. In a final, desperate attempt, he said, "I can fix this. We can all go back to how things were. But his words fell flat in the face of the overwhelming demand for justice. The sound of approaching emergency services on the radio, barely audible over the roar of the storm, signaled that the plane would soon be on the ground. Yet for Eddie, the descent was not just a physical landing, it was the final step in a journey that would redefine his very existence. In that moment, every truth that had been hidden in shadows was brought into the harsh light of reality. As the plane's wheels touched down and the cabin lights steadied, a profound silence settled over the group. It was a silence filled with both sorrow and hope, a pause that allowed every heart to absorb the magnitude of what had just transpired. The betrayal, the confessions, and the raw, unfiltered emotions had woven together a tapestry of pain and resilience. A tapestry that now demanded a choice between clinging to a broken past or forging a new path built on truth and integrity. Eddie looked out the window at the rain-soaked tarmac, feeling the weight of every sacrifice and every lost dream. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult and that the scars of betrayal would not vanish overnight. But in that moment, he also knew that he could no longer live in the shadow of manipulation and deceit. With a deep breath, he resolved to take control of his own destiny, to rebuild his honor brick by brick, even if it meant facing a future filled with uncertainty. In the final moments before the passengers disembarked, Eddie's voice rose once more, soft yet firm, carrying a promise that resonated in the hearts of all who had listened. "Let this day be the start of a new beginning," he said. "A day when we stand together, when we refuse to let betrayal define us, and when we hold on to the truth no matter how hard it may be. Our honor is not something that can be taken from us. It is something we create every day with every choice we make." The words hung in the air as the plane's doors opened and the passengers stepped out into the rain. For Eddie, the long, tumultuous journey was far from over, but the burden of betrayal had been shared, and with it, a spark of hope had been ignited. The storm outside was beginning to clear, and as he stepped off the plane, Eddie carried with him the promise of redemption, a promise that even in the midst of darkness, the truth would always find a way to shine through. The rain had eased into a gentle drizzle as the passengers stepped off the plane, each one carrying the weight of the night's revelations like a silent scar. Eddie lingered at the doorway, watching the droplets shimmer in the pale light of the early dawn. In that quiet moment, the chaotic confrontation of the cabin gave way to a deep, resonant stillness, a pause that invited him to reflect on everything that had transpired. As the crowd dispersed into the cool morning air, murmuring among themselves and sharing tentative glances, Eddie found himself drawn to a small bench tucked away near the terminal's exit. He sat slowly, still grappling with the taste of betrayal and the burden of newfound truths. The storm outside had subsided, leaving behind a washed-clean world. Yet, inside him, the battle between honor and dishonor raged on. He clutched the faded letter that had started it all, feeling its fragile paper against his fingertips, a reminder of promises made long ago and of the sacrifices that had been both honored and exploited. Eddie's mind replayed the events of the flight in a disjointed montage. The shocking confession of Marty had cut him deeply, a wound not inflicted by an enemy on the battlefield, but by a brother in arms. Marty's remorseful eyes and trembling words still haunted him. The betrayal was profound, yet in that darkness, a spark of defiance had ignited, a determination to reclaim his identity and confront the corruption that had turned loyalty into a weapon. Captain Doyle's faltering attempts at justification and Olivia's steady, unwavering support had added layers of complexity to a night that had shattered his expectations of honor. He thought about Olivia's words, spoken with a mix of sorrow and strength. "Our honor is not something that can be taken from us. It is something we create every day with every choice we make." Those words echoed in Eddie's heart, stirring a determination to rebuild what had been lost, brick by brick, despite the betrayal. As he sat on that bench, the cool morning breeze whispering against his skin, Eddie began to understand that the resolution of his journey lay not in erasing the past, but in accepting its lessons and choosing a path forward. In the hours that followed, as the airport slowly awakened and the routine of life resumed, Eddie sought out the few who had shared his burden that night. Olivia, with her calm authority and compassionate eyes, approached him quietly. "Eddie," she said softly, "I know that tonight has shaken you to the core. But remember, even the deepest betrayals can lead us to discover a strength we never knew we had." Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder, and in that touch, he found a glimmer of solace. He nodded slowly, understanding that healing was a process that began with acknowledging the pain and choosing to learn from it. Later that day, in a small, sunlit room of the terminal, a meeting was arranged with several of the key figures from the flight. The discussion was unhurried, serious, and laden with the shared responsibility to set things right. Marty was present, his eyes heavy with regret as he listened to Eddie's measured words. There was no dramatic outburst this time, only a quiet, painful understanding that the wounds of betrayal could only begin to mend if the truth was embraced. Marty apologized once more, his voice choked with remorse, and admitted that he had been caught in a web of orders that had dehumanized both him and those he was meant to protect. The conversation wasn't about absolution, but about accountability and the recognition that every action had a consequence. In that room, a tentative plan was formed to expose the network that had manipulated loyalty and honor for its own gain. It was a small step, but one that promised to pave the way for reform, a promise that the sacrifices of those who had served would be honored rather than exploited. For Eddie, the path ahead was still uncertain. There was a lingering ache, a combination of sorrow, anger, and the hope of redemption. He realized that the moral implications of his journey were vast. The betrayal wasn't merely a personal affront. It was emblematic of a system that had forgotten the sanctity of sacrifice. His internal monologue wandered through memories of camaraderie and valor, the long nights of reflection in the barracks, and the fierce determination that had once driven him to risk everything for a cause he believed in. Now, confronted with the stark reality of manipulation, he felt a renewed responsibility, not only to himself but to every soul who had been diminished by a callous system. As the meeting drew to a close, Eddie stepped outside into the fresh light of day. The world seemed both painfully familiar and strikingly new, a landscape washed clean by the rain, yet marked by the scars of the night before. He walked slowly through the terminal, each step deliberate, each breath a quiet affirmation of his resolve to move forward. In his heart, he carried the weight of lessons learned, the cost of blind loyalty, the complexity of human frailty, and the essential need to stand for truth even when it meant standing alone. Sitting again at the bench, Eddie opened the faded letter and read the worn words that had once given him hope. Now, they took on a layered meaning. He saw in them the reminder that every sacrifice was a thread in the tapestry of his life, a tapestry that, despite being marred by betrayal, was also rich with the colors of resilience and renewal. The letter no longer symbolized a promise unfulfilled. Instead, it represented the potential for rebirth. It urged him to find beauty in the brokenness, to seek the lessons hidden within the pain. In that reflective silence, Eddie allowed himself to grieve, not just for the betrayal he had suffered, but for the loss of innocence and trust that had defined his earlier years. He acknowledged that the moral complexity of his journey was profound. The choices he had made, and those forced upon him by others, had shaped his identity in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Yet, with that understanding came a profound clarity. He could no longer allow the past to dictate his future. Instead, he would forge a new path, one that embraced the truth of his experiences, both the light and the shadow. The final realization settled over him like a soft blanket. Healing was not about erasing the scars, but about accepting them as part of his story. Every mark was a testament to battles fought and the wisdom gained from each encounter with betrayal. With a deep, steadying breath, Eddie resolved to rebuild his sense of honor on his own terms, an honor that was earned not by the approval of corrupt authorities, but by the integrity of his own choices. In this new chapter, he would be guided by compassion, justice, and an unwavering commitment to truth. As the day wore on, Eddie rose from the bench with a sense of quiet purpose. The moral weight of the past night would forever remain a part of him, a reminder of the delicate balance between loyalty and betrayal, sacrifice and exploitation. But now he carried that weight with a renewed strength, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey toward redemption was far from over. Yet in the clear light of day, Eddie felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that the truth once revealed and embraced could transform not only his life, but also the lives of all who had been touched by the darkness of deception. With that resolve, Eddie stepped forward into the brightening world, the remnants of the storm dissolving into memory, replaced by the steady promise of a new beginning. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.